Hey, Adam,
Geez,
one
why,
thing.
why do you think they called bumpers, Gary?
I don't know.
Because they come at the beginning and at the end, like bumpers.
Alex, you're a marketing guy. Do you like that design behind Paul? Does that sweet logo thing look pretty cool to you?
Hey, I forgot to hit the record button.
Yeah, that's really professional, isn't it?
Well, this is a professional podcast.
I met her in a parking lot and was handed 2 little Yorkies. And the only person I knew that knew Yorkies was Paul. So I called Paul and said, Paul.
Sweet Talk is a weekly 20-minute podcast brought to you by the Continuing Education and Workforce Training Division of Idaho State University's College of Technology. Find us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and SoundCloud and subscribe today. Now it's time to get started with Sweet Talk.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Sweet Talk, our weekly podcast here at Idaho State University's Continuing Education and Workforce Training. I am Paul Dickey. I'm the apprenticeship coordinator here at Sweet. And as always, joining me is our interim director, Raylan Price. Raylan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm having a lot of fun this morning with Paul and Angie on the podcast, and we look forward to visiting with all of you.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
and Angie Wilhelm, our marketing director, is joining us as well. Angie kind of taking the reins on the podcast a lot because I've been absent, and I do apologize for that.
No, thank you so much, Paul. I'm really excited to kind of dive into this. I think it'll be a really unique perspective for people to kind of understand how our podcast has evolved.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about the podcast. Now, we started this podcast in 2019, and we were reviewing some of the numbers that the other day, and we said, hey, you know what? We should talk about how the podcast got created and how it's grown, and also why do we have this podcast? Raylan,
All good questions, Paul.
Yes. So Raylan, you were like one of the early guests of the podcast, correct?
I believe so. We were getting ready for emergency medicine conference and had the opportunity to bring on some of our presenters and people supporting the conference. So that was a very interesting experience, very uncomfortable because it's something I hadn't really ever done before. But maybe, Paul, maybe you could talk about how we got even to
That point, yes.
yeah.
So back in 2019, Jason Batalden, who was our previous associate director, had approached myself and Gary Salazar, our previous director, about creating this podcast. And his idea was that we'd interact with the community, we'd have some content that we could share out on a regular basis, and also it would be a way of kind of networking with people across the university and the community that we live in. So Gary Salazar, the director at the time, his response was, why would we do that?
I can totally see Gary saying that.
Yeah, Gary was very much against the whole podcast concept. He just didn't know why we would do that, what benefit it would have for us as our department. And Jason was very adamant, saying, hey, this is a way that we could learn about other people in our community. This may be a doorway to be able to meet people to teach classes. It may be a way for us to get our name out there so people understand what we do better in our community. And
Yeah.
Gary, very reluctantly said, okay, let's try it.
The thing about Gary is he may have expressed reluctance, but then he always is so supportive of the project.
Oh, yeah.
And I think he became a big proponent of Sweet Talk and actually enjoyed participating in the podcast.
So Raylan, you are so correct. So basically, we started the podcast and then we started having guests on. And, Gary and Jason were kind of the hosts at the time when they would have guest people on. And so on a regular basis. And at that time, what we were doing we were going down to the studio and on campus, I was
Mhm.
setting up cameras and microphones and miking everyone, and the people would have to travel to campus. We'd get them a parking pass. They'd come in, we'd sit down, but then we decided on the 20-minute format because we figured 20 minutes would be enough time to kind of introduce, give information, share that out to the community without overstaying our welcome.
Yeah.
And over time, Gary started, really enjoying the interaction with these people because we started learning about all of these different community services and events and the people who help across campus. And so Gary also, Gary started to appreciate that he started meeting the people in the community.
Yes.
So
And
over time,
bringing ideas to us for
and
people to
yes.
be on the podcast. Yes.
yes, and so Gary became like the biggest cheerleader for the podcast, and got to the point that we just go, there's no way Gary would ever give this up now. In that vein, the podcast has become a source of us meeting with the community and even people from out of state, and learning about different services, different events, and so much about that we weren't aware of before.
Sure. Well, and I think, when we started the podcast, I say we, as in Sweet, as a team, podcasts were just kind of becoming known, right? They were not as popular as they are now. And so trying to figure out, a great format for that and trying to get people to be comfortable. It's one thing to talk into a microphone without anybody seeing your face, but when you're recording, doing video and audio, that can cause a little bit of discomfort. And so, but I think nowadays podcasts, there are so many podcasts, and it's a great way to have that conversation, right? That you can't have in just like an interview almost. So
Right. And that, let's go back to that format. We decided on the 20 minutes, but then we also said, hey, let's record video as well so that we could have YouTube content and podcast content at the same time. And again, also some people like to consume their information through a video source rather than just an audio source. And then they get to actually kind of connect with us better on the video if it's not just an audio podcast. But again, we were going down to that studio on a regular basis. We kind of scheduling on Friday. My role was a little different because I was doing the filming and making sure the audio recording was fine. We did invite all our interns at the time, and we kind of encouraged them to ask questions. And I started asking questions a lot because I these guests would come in and I would really be interested in what they had to say.
yes, and actually, as somebody on the podcast, that was very helpful to have somebody in the audience giving us other questions as well. Yeah, it was kind of fun.
And so that's the way it was going on. We studio doing a block of them on a Friday, and then COVID. And then COVID happened, and we were, lockdown happened. We were all working from home at the time, and Jason, came to me and says, "How are we going to do this podcast?" And we thought about it, and we said we could try doing it on Zoom. We could try doing it on Zoom. And at the time, not a lot of podcasts were doing it.
Zoom, huh?
they were. It's super common nowadays. But at the time, we said, "Hey, let's try doing it at Zoom." And what we found was, it was easier to schedule because then people could drop in on a Zoom session, and participate, and then log out.
Yeah.
And my role also changed quite a bit because initially, Jason wanted me there to make sure that the audio and video were working as best as we could, knowing that the guests, we were relying on whatever the guests were coming in with. If they had whatever quality webcam and microphone, we try to work our best around that. But because I was there now in the Zoom session, because initially we were going, hey, Paul, log in, make sure that everything's working fine, then you can log out. They just started saying, hey, can you just stay? And I started becoming more of a co-host. Gary, took a little more of a backseat on at that time because of COVID, his actual workload increased because he had to do more coordination with everyone working from home. So it made more sense for Jason and I to start taking over the podcast.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then when Jason left, Gary came back in, right?
Yes.
As a
We were
co-host.
back in the office at the time, and Gary took over a much larger role. So it was Gary and I, for the most part, doing the podcast together. And then we were able to hire our new marketing director,
Yes.
Angie. And then so Angie became the third host on the show. And I think, Angie, what was your feeling about when you found out about the podcast and then you would have a role in it?
Honestly, I was a little bit excited because from a marketing perspective, it's very unique, right? And the content of the podcast as well was very, very unique, specifically because we are a continuing education. So our student base demographics looks sometimes a little bit different than traditional 4-year or even 2-year university. So I believe that some of the guests that we have on can really help some of the student base that we have on our own campus, as well as bring a little bit of information to the greater community as a whole. So I felt like it was a really interesting addition to traditional marketing.
Oh, that's awesome. And it's been great. Angie has brought a whole new kind of view to kind of more of a targeted view, I guess, to our podcast and going out and finding great content for our podcast. It's been really fun to connect to people and groups on campus as well as in our community. So thank you, Angie. Nice.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Well, and again, we had that series of all the clubs and organizations on campus, which was great. I think that gave us a lot of information that students who are listening to the podcast can utilize. We've had a lot of charitable organizations on the podcast that we can help spread their message. And again, this is part of the reason that we have this podcast is for that community case. And of course, we do a little of our self promotion as well. When we promote some of the upcoming classes that we're going to have and the events that we put on.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that a little bit as well. I think that what you had said before, Paul, about networking is really, really important. When it comes to some of our classes, they are so low cost comparative to a 2 or 4-year degree, and many of them can lead into those 2 or 4-year degrees. So what can happen when we network is someone that is working in an organization may come across a person that does need to upskill, that would really benefit from a program that could help them land a job that gives them a livable wage. And I believe our programs are a really great starting base for people who either want something to be able to work right away, where that might be one of Paul's programs, or short-term training that might be phlebotomy or CNA, but also people that want to use those to traject into a 2 or 4-year degree. So networking with people throughout the community helps us spread their word, but also helps them understand what types of programs we can provide to students who really just need to get into that workforce a little bit quicker than some traditional degrees would allow them to.
I remember we had a student on the podcast. I can't remember her name, which is terrible. It's been a while ago, but she was so excited to learn that not only did we have the workforce training programs, but that as herself as a college student could come and take a dance class, or a painting class, an art class, or a cooking class. And she was so excited, about what we do here at Workforce Training. So I love that. I love that we have such diversity to be able to meet those needs in the community with workforce training, with our community education, with our lifelong learning groups. It's really a wonderful platform.
Yeah, and the benefit of this podcast, a side benefit is I get to learn so much about so many different topics. There was one stands out in my mind was the woman that we had on a few years ago, early in the podcast history, that talked about her research on bats. We had that as a Halloween episode, bats. And I learned so much about the research that she was doing, and it was fascinating. Also, we had this gentleman on years before that was helping build bicycles for low income or homeless people so that they could get around town better. And I thought that I didn't even know that such a thing existed. And I was so moved by the work that he was doing, just because he wanted to.
Yeah, giving back. And who can forget the Grilled Cheese Club?
The grilled
yes.
cheese.
I love that. And what a surprise that was. I'm amazed by the ingenuity of our students and the clubs that they have and the organizations on campus. It's been awesome to connect with all of these different groups and people.
Yeah, when I go into each episode of these podcasts, I usually go in cold. I don't ask Angie, I just show up, and then from there on, because it spurs a lot of questions as we go through the podcast from me. You probably notice that most people who have listened to the podcast knows I ask a lot of questions.
But that's great because, we learn every single podcast. I learn something. I learned something new that I didn't know about my community, about the university, or about just a random topic, right? That I didn't know that I needed to know, but then I'm so glad that I did.
Yeah.
Learn about it.
And Summer, I guess, has some really great stories to share. I remember Darren Jernigan was on one time, and he was talking about his experience as a wilderness medic person, and he had some stories to share on that, and they were fascinating. And because again, the podcast is 20 minutes, and sometimes that 20 minutes is up, and I go, no, I still want to hear some more.
Yeah, I oftentimes get to the end of the podcast. When I first started doing the podcast, I think that was one of the things that scared me the most. I had a list of things, because I was afraid that I was going to run out of something, a question, or that there would be this weird silence on there, while we were looking at each other and not knowing what to say. But what I've learned is there are so many things to learn about individuals and about what they're doing. And it's actually becomes pretty fun.
And that's the one thing is, this podcast, yes, it's all community outreach. It's the way we connect. It's the way we network. Here's the secret. This is really fun. So when we have these episodes, a lot of times our guests are very apprehensive. They're a little nervous, but almost all of them, by the time they finish, and we turn off the microphones, the first thing they say is, "That was fun."
Yeah, it was fast and it was fun, right?
Yes.
That's
20 minutes goes, when you're on the podcast, 20 minutes goes by so fast.
so right. So right.
So Angie, we've talked about the podcast, but we actually have increased our listener base quite a bit over the few years and it's been going up and up every year. And this year, we've already reached increase in numbers from last year, months ahead of time. Is that correct?
That is correct. The first year that the podcast aired, I believe we had around 400 people that listened to it. This year we have a little over 4,000 compared to last year. That was almost 3,000. What's really unique about our growth is that we've always had a really steady audience from the Midwest. It's very, very interesting to me. But I believe that a lot of the topics we have, whether that's our series on what you need to do to prepare for college, such as your scholarship office, admissions, those types of things, even the series we have around this time of the year that talks about things like the United Way or the food banks. Those topics carry on throughout the country. So regardless of what university you may be looking at, some of those topics that we have in the Prepare for College courses are going to translate to any university. Many of the charitable organizations we have on exist in some way or form across the country. So that might be why we're getting some viewership from the Midwest, but it's what I really love about some of our topics is that they are universal across the nation. So yes, we are, not only are we increasing, and we actually have worldwide viewers as well. So it's really interesting to look at our insights regularly.
Thank you,
Wow.
viewers, for coming on and listening. And yes, so looking ahead, Angie and Paul, what can our listeners and viewers expect to hear and learn?
Well, I had this conversation with you this morning, Raylan, because we were talking about housing on campus and some of the other benefits, services that students can get. And I was thinking that maybe, if someone was coming on campus as a brand new student, maybe some of those type of informations that we can have and have some of the guests on the university. Also, we always have guests about upcoming events. So we should be talking, I think soon about emergency medical conference coming up as well. But here's the thing, it's a podcast. We're always looking for guests. So if you're listening to this podcast and you'd love to be on the podcast and you want, you maybe have an organization or event or even, a book that you'd like to promote, reach out to us. Let us know. We'd love to hear from you. And that being said, we probably should wrap up. Plug. So years ago, Jason and I did a 5-part series on the podcast about podcasting. It's podcast about podcasting about podcasting. So it's a 5-part series. So, you might be listening to this and we go, well, how do I start a podcast? Well, we have that 5-part series. You could go back and listen to that. It's all still very relevant. So I do encourage you, if you're listening to this and you go, I'd like to start one, go back, listen to those. That gives a lot of good tips on how to get going and how to start podcasting yourself.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay. Now, thank you guys for, thank you guys for being on today. This was a little, because this episode was just us, so it's a little jerky than when we have a guest on. But if you guys are interested in what we have to offer for classes, please visit our website at cetrain.isu.edu, or you can email us at cetrain@isu.edu, or give us a call at 208-282-3372. And this podcast, as you hit, is the way that we reach the community. We talk to the community. So if you like it, please like, share, subscribe, spread the word. We greatly appreciate it. Raylan, Angie, I appreciate you being here so much. And Angie, thank you for taking everything on your shoulders when I haven't been able to make it recently. I do appreciate it.
Well, thank you. This is a really, really great experience, I think, for everybody in this office.
Thank you all.
And be safe out there.
I was going to just say it.